The huge difference, and it will be a difficulty for biographers going forwards, is that people in the 20s, 30s and 40s used to write those curious things called letters. And now everything's on the internet, so you've got to snag people when they're alive. And I say to people who are were friends of Diana, for example, write it down, because you'll forget about it, and it's a piece of history.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming inside of the library on a beautiful night. I promise it will be just as beautiful in here. I'm excited to introduce historical biographer Andrew Morton. Morton studied history at the University of Sussex with a focus on the aristocracy and the 1930s. He has written biographies of members of the British royal family, as well as celebrities including Tom Cruise, Angelina Jolie, and my favorite, Madonna. He's probably best known for his biography of Diana, Princess of Wales, Diana, Her True Story, and most recently, 17 Carnations, The Royals, the Nazis, and the Biggest Cover-Up in History. I'm so excited to talk to him tonight. Please welcome Andrew Morton.
Well, good evening, everybody. Don't ever say the Brits don't bring the good weather.
And I promised a good crowd, and thank you, Boston, for always delivering. Excellent readers here. So I'm going to ask some questions, and then I'm going to throw it to you guys so you can be thinking of all of your excellent questions that prove this is the best city to have a reading. I just want to start by talking about the origin of this book and when you dove into this topic and this character.
Well, some of you may have bought 17 Carnations, which is my last book, and it was about the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, their links to the Nazi Party, and how the British and American governments had conspired to cover it up. And when I was researching that book, I got to know the family of a chap called Herman Rogers. And he was a man who was very close to Wallis, and I wanted to explore that relationship further. Sorry about that. In addition, when I was writing 17 Carnations, I realised that the page came alive when Wallis entered the stage, because she was an intriguing character, and I wanted to know more. I wanted to explore more about her relationships, and especially her relationship with Herman.
I imagine that happens often in your line of work with your level of research, that you start looking into something and someone seemingly minor in a story, you might say, I'm going to put a pin in that for later.
Yeah, absolutely. But more and more, it's like you're doing a film, and there's, you set up a. Is there? I don't know if it's this or yours. But a lot, so many films, it's just they set up like a small city, and then they break it down, and everybody goes their own sweet way, and all that effort goes to waste. And I often feel that. I get to know people, I build up contacts, say it's about Tom Cruise or Diana, and then you continue your friendship, but then you don't write another follow-up. And this was ideally placed to do a follow-up.
It also seems like an incredible time to write this book, that this character seemed alive to me in the moment that we're in. It's just a remarkable time to look at how the world saw a woman and how the world might see this woman now.
Yeah, absolutely. When you think that the king abdicated because the woman he wanted to marry was twice divorced with 2 husbands living, and then you compare that to May the 19th, when you'll see Meghan Markle, biracial American actress, also divorced, walk down the aisle at St. George's Chapel. I just ask you to do one thing. Just listen carefully, because beneath the sound of the choir singing, you'll hear a low humming, and that low humming will be the Duke and Duchess of Windsor spinning in their graves. Seriously, just listen, because they're buried at Frogmore, which is in the grounds of Windsor Castle. So in a sense, Wallis shows you how far women had to come at that time, because, she was a little minx, she was a flirt, she was a coquette, she admitted it. Her friends used to call her the biggest tease alive, and she used all her feminine wiles to trap men, or to inveigle, or to seduce men, but seduce them in the way that they fell for her.
Well, so this is the part that is most interesting. Ooh.
I'm going to just stop you out. Keep talking.
Oh, that's okay. One of the things that interests me most about this story is sort of how we perceive, as an advice columnist, right? I'm always looking for love and drama. This book has a lot of it. It seemed to pave the way, this relationship, for a love-based union and a real desire for a partner that maybe wasn't always a priority. I mean, right? I mean, there are a lot of arrangements of arrangement, right? The people who couple off because they're of the same place in the world, and there's a lot more happening here.
Well, Queen Victoria insisted that any prince or princess had to marry a German prince or princess, and that was only changed in 1917 when George V issued an order in council allowing members of the royal family to marry people from Britain. So the royal family went from being a caste to being a class. They allowed new arrivals to come into it. And for the Prince of Wales, he was focusing mainly on married women. And when you look through his romantic life, what he did was he had a certain technique. He would write them letters, dripping with passion and love and so on, and then he would buy them a dog. Thelma Furness got a Pekingese, Wallis got a Cairn Terrier, and then he'd buy them a little bit of jewellery. And all the while, when this was happening to Wallis, she was smiling to herself because she thought, this is exactly his shtick. This is the way he does it. So she thought that she was just one more bright, shiny object on the conveyor belt of romance, and that at some point he'll see another bright, shiny object and go for that one. So she never really took her relationship with the king as seriously as he took her. And this was to prove critical, because she just thought it was all a great lark. When he used to phone her, and in those days, remember, you had to phone a hotel lobby or a restaurant, and she would hold the receiver out, and her friends would listen in as he's simpering away, saying how much he loved her, missed her, wanted her, desired her, needed her, all the rest of it. And she would go, "Yes, dear," and all her friends would be kind of stuffing handkerchiefs in their mouths because it was just such a hoot. And so the character of Wallis, though, she was a woman girl from Baltimore, very strong personality, always made the big decisions in her life herself. She ignored what her mother had to say, ignored what her aunt had to say, hence her first marriage. Her first marriage was to an aviator, Win Spencer, and this was against the advice of her mother and grandmother, everybody. But she went ahead, and she spent another 7 or 8 years repenting. And the biggest decision of her life was taken out of her hands, and that was the abdication. When the king told her on the telephone, she was staying in the south of France, "I've decided to abdicate," she said to him, "You goddamn fool." And then she looked for the nearest boat that was going to China, because she wanted to scarp her. She knew that she would be painted as the blackest woman in history for in some way encouraging the king to abdicate.
For those, many of you who are just getting the book tonight, what do you think it was about her that changed him in such a way?
You've all seen pictures of Wallis. She's not a looker. I mean, somebody said.
I mean, people. I did so much I did a lot of like hunting for as many pictures as I could possibly find because I was like, is that fair? And how are we judging this? And but
well, somebody said the other day she looked like Kim Kardashian. I said, well, it's Kim Kardashian without the curves. I mean, she is pretty two-dimensional, but that's not the point about her. When you see movie footage of her, and I have movie footage of her when she went to Balmoral to stay with the king, and she's bright, alive, she's laughing, she's holding court. She was very vivacious, and she understood that a woman's role was to support, encourage her man. And as far as the king was a very edgy, nervy character, always fiddling with his cufflinks, in fact, one of his mistresses, Thelma Furness, taught him how to needlepoint so he could do something with his hands, because he would never settle with a book or a magazine. He was always agitated. And Wallis was able to calm him down, always treated him with respect, but also as a human being. And it was always the Duke this, the Duke that, Sir this, Sir that. But we all know who was wearing the trousers in the relationship. It was young Wallis.
And what did the world have to say about this woman after the news broke that this decision had been made?
Well, never mind before the news broke. They thought she was a spy. The Queen Mary thought she was a sorceress. They had Scotland Yard's finest detective following her husband, Ernest Simpson, and the Prince of Wales around London. They discovered that she was also seeing a used car salesman called Guy Trundle, who was supposed to be a very good dancer. Or so he told the police. And so she was a very busy girl. She was entertaining the Prince of Wales. She was keeping Ernest Simpson happy. And also we had this Guy Trundle. In addition, the whole of London was agog to know, was she having an affair with Hitler's right-hand man, Ribbentrop, Joachim Ribbentrop, who was the foreign minister and at one time the ambassador to London. And he was supposed to be giving her flowers, carnations, some say roses, for every time that they went to bed together. In the end, he added up to 17 carnations, hence the title of the last book. And that was really quite spurious in a way. She always denied it. She always denied seeing him. But she was already, before the abdication, seen as someone who was very much below the salt, to the point where the Prime Minister's advisors suggested that they were deported.
I want to go into the process of this, because reading this book, you truly get a sense of how much you live these stories as you're researching them, as you're reporting them. Can you talk a little bit about your process and how it begins for you? Who do you call first?
Well, in this case, because I had a hunch that Wallis and her relationship with Herman Rogers, this man I've mentioned a couple of times, I was close to members of the Rogers family. They gave me unseen pictures, cinema footage of them together, and I contacted members of the family for letters and so on. And I discovered in the Library of Congress a diary which hadn't been seen before about Wallis's time in Washington and the relationship she had with various diplomats, including a guy called Philippe Espiel, a very handsome, spoke 6 languages, knew his wine, knew his tennis, brilliant golfer, and someone who all the ladies were queuing up to date. Wallis fell head over heels in love with him, had a grand passion, and when he started dating somebody else, she went round to his apartment with a pair of sharp scissors and cut all his trousers off at the knee. So, so that was an insight into Wallis's volcanic temper. So the process that I went through was going to various libraries, contacting people, contacting relatives. Somebody went looking for letters in his barn in Camden, Maine, which is
Well, I want to talk about all of the sort of Boston, New England entries into this book. Can you tell us? I mean, I'm originally from Baltimore, so I love that this is a hometown story for me in two different ways. But can you talk about the ties to Boston that this story has?
Oh, the ties that Wallis has to Boston, or this story has to Boston, are really deep. She spent some time in China for a while. She was looking for a divorce from her first husband, Win Spencer. First of all, she went to France. It was too expensive there. And then she went out to China in the hope of a reconciliation with her first husband. That didn't happen. Then she was dating a diplomat called Jerry Green. He paid her passage to Beijing, or Peking as it was known. There she met this woman who was from Boston, a Boston Brime, called Constance Coolidge. She was the diametric opposite of Wallis. Wallis was very much a woman concerned with the practicalities of life. She didn't give in to romance, whereas Constance, who was known as the Queen of Peking, she had several dozen lovers, at least 4 marriages. One suitor shot himself. Several other suitors threatened to shoot themselves. She was the first woman to do a loop-the-loop in the whole of China. She joined. There was sporadic fighting going on. She went to watch it between 2 warlords. She was an extraordinary character, and quite frankly, she deserves her own biography.
I was just going to say, we'll wait. We'll be here next year, 2 years from now, with that one.
She deserves her own biography. Anyway, so Constance becomes a constant in her life when she comes back to America and also to the south of France. And the other Boston character who has a profound effect on this book is Cleveland Amery. Now, some of you may remember Cleveland Amery. He was a very well-known Boston writer, humorous writer. He had a cat that he wrote stories about, and he became an animal activist. But before that, he was asked by Wallis Simpson to be her ghostwriter. And he agreed. It was a pretty handsome salary. It was $25,000, which was quite a lot in 1955. And he went off to France, and he spent the next 6 months with her. But he walked out on the job because she could never keep her story straight, and he became more and more frustrated by her. So, for example, as he would say, she was here today, gone to Italy for 10 days tomorrow. So he interviewed her, made tapes, made notes, and then he walked out off the job. He found that she was not truthful. She kept changing her story. And also, he really got a vivid insight into the way that her relationship with Edward, the former king, the Duke of Windsor, had deteriorated. And he found the Duke a very weak man, and Wallis a very mean-spirited person. And he went on to other things. He went to write books about and get involved in animal activism. And he just put all his papers, all the interviews he'd done. He went to see the Queen, for example, at Windsor Castle. He had an interview with her. He went to see Ernest Simpson, her second husband, all these major players in Wallis's life. Anyway, he put all his notes, forget about it, and he becomes an animal activist, puts all the socializing behind. Anyway, I looked up where these papers were held, and his daughter, first of all, said, well, I do remember him looking for them in the kitchen, and he couldn't find them. And so I eventually contacted Boston Public Library, and they were not particularly not in the way that they couldn't help me, because all the stuff was stored away, wasn't catalogued, couldn't get it. But eventually they sent me to West Roxbury, where myself and Mary Bender, who's in the audience at the back there, who's a librarian, we went through a mountain of boxes, he'd left 166 boxes to Boston Public Library. And this place is like the size of an ice rink. And it was full of these vanilla coloured cardboard boxes. So we started dragging them out, and there was stories about bison and wolves and cats and dogs and all the rest of it. There were reindeer antler heads. There were golf clubs, golf balls, shaving brush. I mean, it was just like somebody just taken it all to Goodwill and got lost and dropped it off at Boston Public Library. And anyway, after about, 2 hours, and it was a miserable, wet, cold February day, not like today, and we eventually tried this box, and we pulled out a folder, and there was a picture of Wallis Simpson in a swimsuit. Then I looked at something else. It said picture of man, woman, and child, and that was George VI, the Queen, and Princess Elizabeth, or the then Queen and Princess Elizabeth. Then there were pictures of the King in a swimsuit, bare-chested. There were letters, postcards. There was half-finished manuscript. For me, as a biographer, it was like finding an Aladdin's cave of material. And for the next week, Mary and I went through this stuff, photographing it and photocopying it, and I went off with my satchel full of swag. And there's still more there, quite frankly, because after a week, we ran out of time. And so, for me, Boston was a very, very happy hunting ground.
Can you talk about the difference between researching a book about history from decades ago or centuries ago versus someone right now? I imagine that the level of cooperation and participation you get when you're looking into a story like this is different than perhaps pursuing a story about the royal family right this second.
Well, the massive difference is that you can speak to the people for a contemporary biography, whereas obviously the Duke and Duchess of Windsor are no longer with us, and also the huge difference, and it will be a difficulty for biographers going forwards, is that people in the 20s, 30s and 40s used to write those curious things called letters, and now everything's on the internet, so you've got to snag people when they're alive. And I say to people who are were friends of Diana, for example, write it down, because you'll forget about it, and it's a piece of history. What your interaction with her was a piece of history, and because people get very, very secretive, they feel that they shouldn't speak. Well, I feel that obviously as a biographer, you should actually, even if you're not going to speak about them in the next 5 years, at least when you're gone, at least you leave a record. And that's always been something I say to people when you're dealing with someone who's alive.
But as you were talking about this love affair, I always have to think, well, what if these people wrote me a letter? Or what if they were dealing with it now? What their social media might look like? And I imagine that now when you're sort of watching a romance unfold or a person unfold as a public figure, there's just a very different kind of record that might exist in the world.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I mean, I think that now people live in plain sight. People will post their new makeup on, and there's we live in a totally different world where people post the surface but never deal with the interior.
We mentioned the wedding that is coming up. Can you talk about the cultural moment we're in with royalty in general? I mean, there's like this American obsession, right? I mean, just that's a particular thing. I can't tell you how many people talk to me about the crown. I mean, these are narratives that don't get old to us. We are fascinated by them, and every time I think that we have aged out of it, that we're in an era where there are other things to pay attention to, I am proven very much wrong by myself dropping everything to see the white coat that Meghan Markle is wearing that I want to buy, but it's sold out.
So you're that one. I have to say, if I had $1 for everybody who said to me, "Have you seen The Crown?" I could afford myself a decent meal. The fascination, it's a combination of things, isn't it? It's the brilliance of the way they've made The Crown, which has intrigued people, and the other aspect, of course, is that there's been a preamble to it. You've had Victoria, you've had the Queen as a movie, and so you've had an awful lot of cultural references. But at the same time, the reason why that program has proved itself so popular, quite frankly, is the sex, because they're all having sex all the time. When you actually think about it, it's just it is a series of bedroom scenes masquerading as history. And so you've got the Queen and Prince Philip. I mean, no British company would make this. you have Lord Snowdon in bed with two others, a man and a woman. You've got you've got Margaret, lascivious and wanton. It is Peyton Place with coronets.
And this book, though, I mean, this is a character. The central force of this book is a sexual, flirtatious, vibrant person, which felt very. This is not a two-dimensional person either. I mean, there's some of what appeals to me about these narratives. It's like I was able to, with this book, really get into the mind of someone who had a full romantic life. I mean, do you ever feel when telling these stories, especially when you get into records that might be from unreliable narrators or narrators who no longer are around, here are things I need to leave out, here are things I definitely want to put in? What goes into those choices?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, what you're trying to do is sketch the outline of somebody's character. And so you don't want to end up, first of all, duplicating issues, and you don't want to go, and there are many people disliked Wallis, and many people believed, as I say, she was a sorceress. Queen Mary thought she was a sorceress. She thought she was a Nazi spy. So but that perception of her, even though it was untrue, defined people's responses and defined practical measures. So, for example, the Prime Minister authorised Scotland Yard to have her followed because they thought, why is this woman from Baltimore, with no social standing, no title, no money, what's she doing with the Prince of Wales? So in some respects, when you're writing somebody's biography and also sketching out a character, you have to take the mythology as well, because that also is part of the way people react to them.
You've also written about just American celebrities, as we've talked about. How have you chosen those subjects, and how might you compare them in terms of how untouchable they are or how unknown they are, despite being so well known as a member of the royal family? What do they share, and what's different about that sort of? You mentioned Kim Kardashian and that similarity, and it makes me think of how, I don't love the idea of thinking of American royalty as those celebrities, but that's what we have, right? These people whose faces we see all the time. So I'm wondering what led you into the choices you made about who to focus on in American celebrity culture.
Well, they all differ, but the one abiding rule was: is there a narrative arc? Is there a change? And so somebody like, for example, Angelina Jolie, she was a wild child, was cutting herself, anorexic, bulimic, living with a boy aged 15, not listening to her father, John Voight, totally blanked him. And yet now we see the transformation over the last few years into this goodwill ambassador for the United Nations. So so that's the exploration that how has somebody gone through that? Tom Cruise, the interesting thing about him is his religion, because Scientology is a very is a notorious organisation. Why did he decide to join it? What motivated him? He was a man at the top of his game. This is an organisation that normally brings people in when they're falling or aspiring. So you make these kinds of choices. I mean, sometimes it's just by pure accident. I ended up writing Monica Lewinsky's biography with her a few years ago, and that was because somebody in a newspaper had written, this is where myth becomes reality, had written a story saying that Andrew Morton's writing Monica Lewinsky's biography. That ended up going on the wires. Her lawyer read it in New York. He thought, well, that's quite a good idea, Princess Diana's biographer. And he contacted my publisher in London. He called me and said, would you like to write Monica Lewinsky's biography? And when I'd stopped laughing, we poured ourselves a glass of champagne and went to New York to meet the girl. So that was just happenstance.
I think about her a lot recently as the world is changing and we're having different conversations, and how she was portrayed, Monica Lewinsky specifically, and how she might be portrayed now. And you have taken on the responsibility of telling women's stories in I think the majority of your books, right? And women who have some agency, but not all agency, women who might be behaving similarly to their male counterparts, but being judged in a different way. What kind of lens do you put on to ensure that you're telling a woman's story in a way that takes into account all of these oppressive systems that they're dealing with at the time? Like, I imagine that Wallis was dealing with a different level of scrutiny on appearance than somebody else might if the situation were reversed.
Yes, and with Wallis Simpson, we're dealing with somebody where the options were very, very narrow and very limited. When she was a young lady, 3 out of 100 women went to college. Now that has been transformed. There's probably only 3 in 100 that don't go to college. I'm sure those stats are wrong. So she had to make her way in life with what she had and in the system as it was. But also she was living during a time when that lack of opportunity was breaking up, where you did have more opportunity with the First World War. Women were working more, so she lived through that period. So that is it. That element is described in the book. With Diana, for example, we have a woman who was the shy, rather retiring individual who found herself and who expressed her vulnerability in public and found her courage in public, and did so in a way which had a lot of response from women, especially women around the world.
Before I start throwing it out to people, what's your plan for the wedding? Like, where will you be? How do you approach what you know is a monumental moment? I mean, I've already decided what snacks I will eat and where I might watch, but for you, it's like a whole other situation.
Well, I think I'm commentating on the wedding for ABC, with well, hopefully anyway, if I can find my top hat, and so I'll be chatting away about what the bride is wearing or not.
And just again, before I turn it over, this is as monumental as it seems, right? For this specific marriage to be happening. How are people over there viewing this and watching this?
Your compatriot, Meghan Markle, has very rapidly become a national treasure in Britain, alongside various comedians and showbiz characters who are just like Elton John, who are beloved. And she's hugely popular because people can see in her someone who, total contrast, for example, to Wallis Simpson, whose life was designed around marriage. This is a woman whose life has been designed around expressing herself in public, but also finding a career, making a success of a career, and making a success of a life.
That's why I want the code. Okay, I'm going to throw it out to the audience.
I wonder if you could tell us a little more about what the book's about. I think a lot of people came here to find out about the book, and at this point, I don't think I know what it's about.
Well, then I have failed you as a, as a moderator. What do you want to just sort of state,
Well, as I say, the book started. We have talked about this a little bit, but the book started out as a result of my previous book, 17 Carnations, about the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. But also, it's a book that tries to explore the personality of Wallis, the relationship between Wallis and obviously the King, later the Duke of Windsor, the misnomer of the idea that this was the royal romance of the century, because as the papers that Cleveland Amery had, the various interviews with many people, the King was besotted with Wallis. Wallis was hemmed into a corner. She felt frustrated. She felt that her life had been utterly defined by another person's decision, so that going forwards, rather than being the love match of the century, whilst she was in public very attentive to him and was very respectful towards him, in private it was a different situation. She was dismissive of him, she was sarcastic. He would say from time to on occasion, "Will you be sending me to bed in tears tonight?" And so the dynamic between them went from being an affectionate couple to being one where the Duke was still besotted, but Wallis was indifferent to the point of impatience and bored.
Could you tell us a little bit about her life, how she grew up, who her parents were, and if she had brothers or sisters, what her relationship was with her family?
Yeah, she was born. She was brought up in Baltimore. Two strands to two sides of the family: the Warfields and the Montagues. The Montagues were very happy-go-lucky, witty, live life on the fly. They were intelligent, charming, and they would tell you so themselves. They were full of bravado. The Warfield side, former slave owners, went into commerce, banking, very solid, very straightforward, very practical, very down to earth. It's almost like the earth and the sky. They were very different families, and Wallis always felt that she had those kind of elements inside her. At the same time, she had a very fractious relationship with her mother, because it was her mother who brought her up on her own. Her father died when she was just 5 months old. He died of consumption. He died of TB, and in fact, the poor man never even held her before he passed away, and so they were always the poor relations of these two families, and they always relied on the financial support of her Uncle Sol, who he was known as Mr. Baltimore, and they always found his charity grudging and rather less than what they ever thought they would get. So Wallis felt that she was a poor relation. She was someone who wanted to be number one. She had a great desire to be number one. And just imagine this: she's a little girl playing with pictures of Mrs. Vanderbilt and Mrs. Astor, making up stories of kings and queens, and that was her favourite topic of her imagination, kings and queens, and we all know where that ended up. And she went to an all-girls school, had crushes on all kinds of other girls and some of the female teachers, but her focus as a teenager was on that four-letter word, boys.
I know that she and the Duke were rather thick with one of the Mitford sisters, and I was wondering how she got into that circle, both with him, but also with the kind of the rest of the aristocracy, because I think a lot of us, at least, perceive that the English aristocracy really didn't mix with commoners, and certainly not with Americans.
Well, there were quite a lot of Americans in English society in the 1930s. You'd be surprised. And in fact, how Wallis got into the circles of diplomats and journalists and minor aristocracy was the fact that, Meghan Markle's got a blog. The equivalent then was a salon, and she learned how to make decent cocktails. She invited people over, mainly Americans, mainly people who were staying for a short period of time, and they introduced her to other people, and by degrees she moved into the circles where the Prince of Wales moved. And it wasn't that long before, after boasting to her aunt that one day she was going to meet the Prince of Wales, that she in fact did.
Hi. Could you tell me your opinion about Wallis not receiving the title of Her Royal Highness?
Well, the appellation Her Royal Highness was the biggest blow that the couple faced. Remember, when the king abdicated, he thought that the rest of the royal family would attend the wedding, that the church would approve of it, that it would be generally celebrated by his friends. There were around about 15 people there at the wedding on June the 4th, 1937. Several of them, French functionaries. But the bitterest pill to swallow was the fact that the king, the new king, George VI, had decided against giving her that title. And ironically, when Cleveland Amery was asked by the Duchess on the first day of their collaboration, what title should you give it? Should I give her autobiography? He said brightly, "Let's call it Untitled," and because it was a nice play on words, and he thought that was great. And as he recorded, it was dead silence in the room. So it caused a bitterness between the Duke and Duchess and the rest of the royal family that lasted until the moment they died. And they were hostile to the other members of the royal family. They referred to George VI as that stuttering idiot. They referred to the Queen Mother, or the Queen as she was then, as that Scottish cook. And they refer to Princess Elizabeth as Shirley Temple. And they just had a caustic, bitter relationship with the royal family till they died. No, legally she should have had it. And the Duke took legal opinion on it because, you are supposed to take your husband's title. And they deliberately, how they got round it is that the Home Secretary initially said, fine, call her Her Royal Highness, we don't care. George VI, the new Queen, and the rest of the family did care, and they wanted some way of it being worked out so that they weren't blamed, but it was seen as the official policy. And so what they did, they convened a meeting with various ministers, and they agreed that the Duke of Windsor had only been given that appellation, His Royal Highness, by virtue of the King's gift, and he could withdraw as out of respect for his previous station as King. But they said that he didn't have to, he wasn't obliged to do that for the Duchess of Windsor, and that they were doing her a favour anyway by calling her Duchess of Windsor.
Hi. My question might not be really relevant to Wallis's life, but can you give us more insights about the royal disease, or whether it really existed in the royal family?
You're talking about
Hemophilia?
Hemophilia.
Yeah.
Well, that was something that affected, obviously, some of the royal families of Europe, most notoriously the Russian royal family. it affected the king, Edward VIII, only insofar as he was going to marry a girl called Rosemary Leveson Gower, and he was told that she had a taint in the blood. That is to say that she had haemophilia, and so he was madly in love with her, as he was madly in love with lots of women, and he withdrew his suit.
If there was one thing you would want someone to know, like about this book or about the research process, what would that be?
Well, it was all original. That this book is just full of new research and new material.
Quick question, based on the nicknames of Cookie and Shirley Temple, did they know about it?
Oh yes, they knew about it, and it's one of the reasons why they just did not want them back in London at any price, because they realised that at every dinner party they ever went to, they would mock the royal family. Edward VIII, or the Duke of Windsor, even mocked his own mother, Queen Mary, because she was notorious for going to somebody's house and admiring an antique, and then asking if the person there, her host, would give her the antique, and she would say, "Oh, I'm looking at your chair. What a beautiful chair. Oh, I'm admiring. It would look so lovely in my drawing room." And then the person would normally say, "Well, yes, Mum, we'll send it on to you." "Oh no, I'll take it straight away in the car." and that was.
And I was wondering, was it true that Queen Elizabeth, or Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, had a crush on Edward? Did she set her cap, and that's why she didn't like Wallis? Was that all true?
Well, that's what's been said. I think she would. When you actually look at the timeline of it, the Prince of Wales was busy elsewhere with other girlfriends, so I don't think she would have been setting her cap at someone who was already dating other women.
Hi there. So first of all, I want to say thank you for using my childhood library, the West Roxbury Library. It's such a big part of your book.
Thank you.
My question, though, is how do you think the world would be today if Edward had been king?
Well, there is a move to put a statue on the 4th empty plinth at Trafalgar Square, because the feeling is that if Edward had been king in 1940, when Britain's back was against the wall, he would have argued for an accommodation with Germany, so that somehow Britain kept some of its powers, but relinquished an awful lot of power to the Germans. So, in a way, George VI becoming king was the best thing that ever happened to Britain, and in a curious kind of way, Wallis Simpson was also the best thing that ever happened to the royal family.
I won't be the person to ask if you've seen The Crown, but I'm just curious what your opinion of it is, how factual, how dramatized it is.
Well, there was a scene with the Duke of Windsor talking to the Queen, and the Queen basically saying, "I'm not going to give you a job because of your behaviour during the war." His behaviour during the war was not exemplary by any standards, but I very much doubt that scene happened, because the one thing that the Queen hates is a confrontation, and of course dramatically you need to have a confrontation. So there's an awful lot of dramatic elements in the Crown which don't ring true, but nonetheless the general sense is there.
Thanks. This question comes under the heading of gossip. So, any idea, or do you say in your book, why in the world Wallis stayed in this marriage if she held him in such contempt? She didn't get the queenship that she thought she was going to have. She didn't even get to be called Her Royal Highness. And it sounded like they didn't have as much money as they wanted to have. So, and she obviously was willing to shed husbands like many people shed their winter coats. So why did she stay in it?
Well, that's a good question. I think that she stayed initially because she knew that she would be damned if she did and damned if she didn't. At the same time, they did have money, enough money to have 26 staff, including a telephone operator, and she was quite acquisitive. She had the most magnificent jewellery collection of possibly anyone who's ever lived, certainly in recent times. And for a long time, they both realised that they had to try and make it work, at least in public, because she realised that he had given up the throne to the greatest empire that had ever existed. Having said that, she did love another man, and that man was Herman Rogers. And on his second wedding day, when he was married his second wife, she went up to the second wife, Lucy, and said, "Herman is the only man I've ever loved." And so she nursed a passion for this man who was an avuncular father figure, a brother, a surrogate husband for a time, for most of her adult life. Herman's second wife, Lucy, believed that if she hadn't have got him first, Wallis might well have left the king the Duke for him. It didn't happen. But then she embarked on this curious relationship with this outrageous homosexual called Jimmy Donahue, an heir to the Woolworths fortune. So she behaved in an extraordinary way during the 50s because of the fact that she found no fulfillment with her husband.
What can you tell us about Wallis, the Nazis, and the cover-up?
Quite a lot. How long you got? I mean, Wallis and the Duke, they were in the south of France when the Nazis invaded Belgium and France. And they paid villagers to take all their finest linens and their good thread counts and their porcelain and their silverware into the mountains and hide it. They had two houses, one in Paris, one in the south of France, in Cannes. And during their flight from the Nazis, they went through Spain and ended up in Portugal. And on two separate occasions, they contacted the Nazis via a Spanish aristocrat, and they asked them to look after their houses. And yet these houses were rented and they were empty. So you've got to ask yourself, why did they do it? What was their ulterior motive? And at the same time, you have the Germans wanted to get all the members of the royal families of Europe under their orbit, so that in the old-fashioned way, they would say to them, the King of Norway, the Queen of Holland, and also the Duke and Duchess, that we want you to tell your countrymen to lay down your arms and come under the Nazi influence. And they had a system in place, a spy system, called Operation Willy, where they were going to kidnap the Duke and Duchess from Portugal, and they very nearly succeeded. It was only Churchill telling the Duke, stop messing about, get on a boat and go be the Governor General of the Bahamas, that stopped that from happening. And the Germans offered them 50 million francs, this is the Duke and Duchess, to sit out the war. They offered them a castle in the south of Spain to sit out the war. And they wanted them ultimately to become puppet king and queen of England, in a nutshell.
So before our final question, I just want to thank you, Andrew and Meredith, for joining us here at the BPL tonight, and remind everyone that afterwards we have Trident Books in the lobby who will be selling books, and we're going to be doing an author book signing.
Andrew, it is a truly a pleasure to attend this talk, and I have read your biographies and followed you for many years, so this is wonderful. The first book I read of yours was about Tom Cruise, and I almost feel like a sequel should now come out, because the sunny man that you portrayed, who was at the top of his game and celebrated and courting Katie Holmes, it's a very dark and bleak picture now, where he is openly ridiculed for his movie choices. He is seen as a complete Scientologist and control freak, a derelict father, and definitely a star on the wane. So like when you take an angle to write these books, do you sort of keep in your mind the idea that the perceptions could change completely later on in life?
Yeah, a lot of it's that's my PR talking up there. I think there is the opportunity to do a second book on Tom Cruise, but it won't be me that's doing it, because it was a pretty hard slog, quite frankly, and it's quite disturbing when you meet a lot of people grandmothers who've never seen their grandchildren, wives who've haven't seen their husbands for years because they've been what's known as disconnected by Scientologists. So it's a dark, weird world that you enter when you look into Tom Cruise, and it's a world that obviously he's remained in for most of his adult life.
Thank you all for such wonderful questions. I just have one last one. You're casting the movie today. Who is it?
Wallis. Ooh, that's a good one, isn't it?
All right, maybe you think about it while you're signing, but I tweet it or something. It's hard. I spend a lot of time thinking about it while reading. I challenge you all to do it better.
Well, I think Kristen Scott Thomas would be her sister Serena played Diana in a movie based on my Diana, Her True Story. And at the time, they all thought that she was going to go on to be the biggest star. But it was Kristen, who's now the one up for the accolades.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming.